56 years ago, on a cold December Saturday in the hills east of San Francisco, something happened that nobody who was there has ever been able to fully explain. A free concert, a lineup of the greatest rock bands on the planet. And by the time the night was over, for people were dead, hundreds had been beaten, and a generation that had genuinely believed it was building something new woke up the next morning and had to ask itself what it had actually built. If you want to understand how an afternoon of music became one of the most studied disasters in American cultural history, you need to stay with us until the very end of this story, because nothing about what happened that day makes sense until you understand everything that led up to it. Like and subscribe so you do not miss a single part of it. This is the full story of Altamont. To understand what went wrong at Altamont, you first have to understand what was going right in America in the summer of 1969. Because in the months before that December, an entire generation genuinely believed they were on the verge of something new. 4 months earlier, in August, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people had gathered on a dairy farm in upstate New York for 3 days of music in the rain. Woodstock. Whatever you think of what it represented, there is no question about what it felt like to the people who were there and to the millions who heard about it. It felt like proof. Proof that a generation could come together without violence, without rules, without police forcing them into line, and simply be good to one another. The press called it a miracle. The counterculture called it a nation. And for a few weeks that summer, it seemed like the world had shifted. The Rolling Stones had not been part of that moment. They had been in the middle of a complicated legal situation in England that had kept them off the road for years. And by the time they finally returned to America for a full tour in the autumn of 1969, they were no longer just a rock band. With the Beatles quietly falling apart, the Rolling Stones had become, by common consent, the most important rock and roll group on earth. Their tour was a phenomenon. But almost immediately the criticism started, and it came from an uncomfortable direction. Music journalists and fans who should have been celebrating their return were instead writing about the ticket prices. In a cultural moment defined by the idea of community and shared experience, the Rolling Stones were charging what felt like an obscene amount to see them perform. For a band that had built its identity on rebellion and authenticity, it was an accusation that stung. Mick Jagger was not someone who liked to be accused of greed. And so, somewhere toward the end of that tour, the idea was born. They would finish the American run not with another sold-out arena show, but with a free concert. Open to everyone. A gift to the people who couldn't afford tickets. Their own Woodstock. The idea quickly grew. The Grateful Dead, San Francisco's beloved homegrown giants and the spiritual heart of the Bay Area counterculture, came on board as co-organizers. Soon a lineup began to take shape that was almost impossible to believe. Santana, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Jefferson Airplane, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, the Grateful Dead, and headlining everything, the Rolling Stones. Free of charge, somewhere in the hills around San Francisco, to be announced. It is important to pause here and understand the atmosphere in which all of this was being planned. America in late 1969 was a country under enormous pressure. The Vietnam War had been grinding on for years and was tearing the country apart. The civil rights movement had won legal battles, but racial tension remained explosive. And just a few months earlier, a series of murders in the hills above Los Angeles had sent a wave of genuine terror through the California counterculture. Charles Manson and the people who followed him had killed 7 people, and the dream of free-spirited California living had not recovered. Against all of that darkness, the Woodstock generation still clung to the belief that music could hold something together. That a concert, if it was pure enough, if it was free enough, could be a statement about the kind of world they wanted to build. The free Rolling Stones concert was going to be that statement. What nobody involved in planning it yet knew was that they had less than 3 weeks to make it happen. The original plan was Golden Gate Park, San Francisco's great public space, green and open and deeply symbolic to the counterculture, was the obvious choice. But the city had no interest in hosting 300,000 people in its most beloved park with less than a month of preparation, and the permit was denied. The organizers moved on quickly. A second venue was found, Sears Point Raceway in Sonoma County, a large enough space north of San Francisco. This time things seemed to be moving forward. Contracts were signed. A crew was sent out to begin building a stage. Then, just 2 days before the concert was supposed to happen, Sears Point fell through as well. The problem was the Maysles brothers. Albert and David Maysles were a celebrated documentary filmmaking duo who had been commissioned to follow the Rolling Stones' American tour and capture it on film. The resulting documentary was going to be called Gimme Shelter, and it was going to be a major project. The company that owned Sears Point Raceway realized that the Stones and their film crew were going to generate something very valuable, and they demanded a share of the film rights as part of the deal for using the venue. The Stones refused, and the whole arrangement collapsed overnight. It was now Thursday, December 4th. The concert was in 2 days. There were no fences, no medical facilities, no portable toilets, no staffing plan, and now no venue. Hundreds of thousands of people were already hearing about the Free Stones concert through radio and word of mouth, and were already making plans to travel to California. The machine was moving whether anyone was ready or not. Into that vacuum stepped a man named Dick Carter. Carter owned a motorcycle and stock car racing track out in the dry lowlands of eastern Alameda County, about 50 miles east of San Francisco, between the towns of Tracy and Livermore. It was called Altamont Speedway, and it was not a concert venue by any stretch of the imagination. It was a scrubby, utilitarian racetrack built for racing machines, not human gatherings. There was no water supply. There were no proper sanitation facilities. There was no infrastructure at all. But it had space, and right now space was all the organizers were shopping for. They took it. Crews worked through the night to build a stage from whatever materials were available. The stage that had been constructed at Sears Point could not simply be moved in time, so a new one had to be assembled from scratch in the dark by flashlight by exhausted workers who had no clear plan and no unified leadership. The stage that emerged from those overnight hours was just under 4 feet tall, not much higher than a kitchen counter, and it sat not at the top of a natural slope where crowd pressure would push people away from it, but at the very bottom of a bowl-shaped depression in the land, meaning that 300,000 people would be pressing downward toward the performers with no real barrier between them. The problem of security was now urgent. With no police presence and a stage that offered almost no separation between the bands and the crowd, someone needed to be on the ground, keeping people back. The Grateful Dead had a suggestion. They had worked with local chapters of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club at smaller Bay Area shows, and the arrangement had been informal and mostly without incident. The Angels were a constant presence in the San Francisco counterculture scene. They went to the same concerts, moved in the same circles, and there was a shared sense, however fragile and however naive, that the bikers and the hippies were both outsiders against the same establishment. The Angels were invited to come to Altamont and keep people off the stage. They were to be compensated with $500 worth of beer. Who exactly signed off on what has been disputed ever since by almost everyone who was in the room? The Stones' road manager Sam Cutler insisted that the Angels were never asked to be a police force, that the arrangement was simply for them to protect the generators and stay near the stage. Grateful Dead manager Rock Scully acknowledged his role in recommending them, but denied having formalized anything. Angel member Bill Fritsch recalled being explicitly asked to provide security and explicitly declining that framing. What everyone agreed on was that the beer was delivered, that the Angels arrived, and that no one with clear authority over the event had sat down with the Angels and explained what was expected of them or what the limits of their role were. There was no written agreement. There was no chain of command. There was no one ultimately in charge of Altamont at all. There never had been. The concert was in less than 48 hours. The first cars began arriving before dawn. By the time the sun came up over the brown hills of the Livermore Valley, the roads leading to Altamont were already stopped solid. A highway patrol sergeant described the main approach as one large parking lot with traffic moving through it. Cars were backed up for 20 miles in every direction. People abandoned their vehicles on freeway medians, in ditches, in the middle of farm roads, and walked the rest of the way on foot. Some hiked 10 miles or more. By the time Santana was ready to open the show, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people were already on the grounds, and more were still arriving. The site itself was bleak in a way that announced itself immediately. The hills around Altamont Speedway were dry and brown, scrubbed of anything green, exposed to a cold winter wind. There were not enough portable toilets for any number remotely close to the crowd that had shown up. There was no real food. There was no organized medical presence. The people who had come expecting something like Woodstock found instead a barren industrial landscape with a tiny stage at the bottom of a slope and no way to see or hear anything unless they pushed to the front. And the crowd was not being manageable. As the morning wore on, the area in front of the stage became something between a mosh pit and a trap. People who tried to step back found there was nowhere to step back to. Those who fell risked being trampled. The Angels, already drinking since dawn, responded to every surge with their pool cues, and the pool cues solved nothing, because the people being struck were not choosing to push forward. They were being carried by the mass of everyone behind them. Each blow landed on someone who had no way to obey the order to move back. It was not a crowd being controlled. It was a crowd being punished for existing. Among that crowd, something else was spreading. Someone had added LSD to batches of cheap Gallo wine that was being passed freely through the throng. Thousands of people ingested it without knowing. The effects began rippling through the crowd through the morning, unpredictable and frightening, adding a layer of chemical chaos to a situation already fraying at the edges. Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane arrived at the venue and immediately sensed that something was wrong. She described it afterward as hazy, abrasive, and unsure, nothing like the warmth she had felt at Woodstock. She had expected something loving and instead found something that felt jagged and unresolved. She was not alone in that feeling. Santana played their opening set while the crowd was already fighting at the edges, and the Angels, who had been drinking steadily since arriving, were using their pool cues on anyone who came too close to the stage or the equipment. What made it worse was that the Angels themselves were now primed. Every shove they gave, every person they hit, sent a ripple of fear backward through the crowd that came back as a new wave of pressure. The violence was self-reinforcing. The more they struck people, the more frightened people became, and frightened people in a dense crowd pressed together rather than apart. By the time Santana finished their set and Jefferson Airplane took the stage, the front of the crowd had become a place of genuine danger, and everyone standing in it knew it. Jefferson Airplane came on in the early afternoon, and the violence escalated sharply. During their set, a scuffle broke out near the stage that grew quickly into a brawl. Marty Balin, the band's lead singer, watched from the stage as Angels beat a concert goer and jumped down into the crowd to intervene. He was knocked unconscious by a Hell's Angel. He did not finish the set. Guitarist Paul Kantner stepped to the microphone and addressed the Angels directly, calling out the fact that they had just knocked out his singer. One of the Angels walked up and took the microphone away from him. The confrontation between the two men played out over the public address system in front of hundreds of thousands of people, and it made clear to everyone watching that no one was in charge of what was happening. When a Grateful Dead's crew arrived at the venue and heard what had happened to Marty Balin, the band made a decision. They were not going to play. They got back in their vehicles and left. Their cancellation was not announced to the crowd. It was simply not mentioned. The result was a gap of nearly 2 hours in the middle of the day when there was nothing happening on stage, no music to focus on, no artist to direct the crowd's attention. The temperature was dropping. The light was fading. People were still arriving. The Angels were still drinking. And 200,000 people who had been standing in a cold field for hours with nothing to eat or drink were left to sit with their own unease and wait for the Rolling Stones. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young took the stage in the waning afternoon light, and during their set, Stephen Stills was reported to have been stabbed repeatedly in the leg with a bicycle spoke sharpened to a point by an angel sitting near the stage. He finished the performance. The 4 members of the group left the stage looking visibly shaken. By the time the sun went down over the Livermore Valley, the full crowd had arrived and was now locked in a cold, tense darkness, with the Angels standing in a solid wall across the front of the stage and violence continuing at the edges of the pit. 3 people were already dead, although almost nobody in the crowd knew it yet. A young man had wandered too close to an irrigation canal at the edge of the property and drowned. At the far end of the parking area, 2 Berkeley men Richard Salov and Mark Feeger, had been sitting by a roadside campfire when a car came through the darkness and ran over them both. The driver fled on foot and was never found. The Rolling Stones landed by helicopter in a field nearby and were driven to the stage. Before Mick Jagger had even reached the backstage area, a concert-goer broke through the small security cordon and punched him in the face. He went on anyway. There was nothing else to do. Now a young man named Meredith Hunter was somewhere in that crowd. He was 18 years old, a student from Berkeley, and that morning he had driven out to Altamont in his mother's boyfriend's champagne beige Mustang with his 17-year-old girlfriend Patty Bredhoft and 2 friends. He was dressed carefully, as he always was, in a pale lime green suit jacket and a black shirt with his hat sitting at the right angle. His sister Dixie had begged him not to go. She had grown up watching burning crosses from a pickup truck on California roads, and she knew what those roads could mean for a young black man. She told him so that morning. He had listened to her concern and had laughed it off. He had taken with him a small revolver, almost certainly unloaded, just to have something that looked intimidating if someone gave him trouble. Dixie had laughed at the gun, too. She knew him. He was not a violent person. He was a young man who liked to dress well and dance and be part of something exciting. That morning, the Altamont Free Concert had seemed exciting. By the time the Stones took the stage and the first notes of their opening song poured out into the dark valley, Meredith Hunter was near the front of the crowd, close enough to the stage to feel the music in his chest. He had gotten there after hours of navigating the compressing, hostile mass of people, and the atmosphere had changed him. The drugs that had spread through the crowd had found him. His girlfriend Patty could see it in his eyes. She was pulling at him, trying to calm him, telling him to come back to her. He was somewhere she could not reach. The Stones played their opening songs, and the crowd pushed forward. During Sympathy for the Devil, fighting broke out so intensely that Jagger stopped the song and stood at the microphone and pleaded with the crowd to stop. "Sisters and brothers," he said, "come on now, just cool out." The band started again, and the fighting continued. By the time they reached their 15th song, Under My Thumb, the area directly in front of the stage had descended into something close to collective madness. Meredith Hunter, pushed and struck by the angels who were surrounding the stage, had reached a moment of complete desperation. He climbed onto a speaker cabinet and was immediately set upon. The angels grabbed him and began to beat him. He fell back and ran, and as he ran, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the gun. His girlfriend screamed at him to put it away. He raised it toward the stage, not clearly aimed at anyone, a gesture of pure, terrified defiance from a young man who had run out of options. Alan Passero, a 21-year-old member of the Hells Angels, came at him from behind. He grabbed Hunter's arm, wrested the gun away, and drove a knife into him. He stabbed him twice in the back. Hunter fell. Other angels surrounded the body and continued to beat him as he went down. A young man named Paul Cox threw himself over Hunter's body, trying to shield him, and managed to pull him away from the worst of it. He got Meredith Hunter to a medical area at the edge of the crowd. A helicopter was called for. Meredith Hunter died before it arrived. He was 8 feet from the stage. Mick Jagger was 20 feet away. The Rolling Stones did not know that anyone had died. They played 8 more songs. They closed with Street Fighting Man and were taken by a helicopter to an airport and left. The hills around Altamont slowly went quiet, and a nation of music lovers woke up the next morning and read in their newspapers that something had gone very wrong. In the days after the concert, the scale of what had happened began to come into focus. The hills around the speedway were littered with mountains of debris, abandoned wine bottles, discarded clothing, the wreckage of a gathering that had produced nothing but damage. Hundreds of cars abandoned in the surrounding fields had to be towed. Local hospitals had treated hundreds of people for injuries ranging from drug-induced psychosis to fractured bones. The formal death toll stood at 4. Police in Alameda County knew almost immediately that the stabbing of Meredith Hunter was not an accident and that someone from the Hells Angels was responsible. What they did not know was who. There had been so many angels at the concert, and the chaos of the crowd meant that no straightforward witness account was going to be enough to identify the killer. Then someone told them about the cameras. Albert and David Maysles and their crew had filmed the entire concert for what was meant to be a celebratory documentary about the Rolling Stones tour. They had cameras everywhere, including right at the front of the stage. David Maysles flew back to California with the unprocessed footage and sat down with investigators to go through it. In the blurry, chaotic images from the stabbing sequence, one man stood out. His jacket carried a distinctive patch identifying him as a member of the Hells Angels San Francisco chapter. His name, once the chapter was contacted and the roster examined, was Alan Passaro. In the months that followed, something unusual happened. The investigation that did the most to document what had actually taken place at Altamont was not conducted by the police. It was conducted by a magazine. Rolling Stone published 4 major investigative pieces over the following months, interviewing witnesses, examining footage, reconstructing the timeline of events. The reporters found witnesses who had been at Meredith Hunter's side, including Paul Cox, the young man who had thrown himself over Hunter's body and pulled him away from the beating. Cox described what he had seen with a clarity and grief that no official account had matched. The picture that emerged from that reporting was of an 18-year-old who had been attacked, who had panicked, who had raised a gun he was almost certainly not going to fire, and who had been killed for it. Alan Passaro was charged with murder. His trial took place more than a year after the concert and lasted 17 days. The central piece of evidence was the Gimme Shelter footage, a documentary commissioned to celebrate a rock and roll tour that had instead captured a killing on camera. The defense presented the footage as proof of self-defense. Passaro had seen a man with a gun threatening people near the stage and had intervened. The jury deliberated for 12.5 hours and acquitted him on grounds of justifiable homicide. The same footage that had seemed to condemn him turned out to be the thing that saved him. Passaro was nevertheless returned to prison on separate charges unrelated to Altamont. He was found drowned in a California reservoir in 1985 in circumstances that were never fully explained. The Hunter family received no communication from the Rolling Stones. No call, no letter, no public acknowledgement of what had happened to Meredith. Eventually, months after the Rolling Stone investigation appeared, the Stones' lawyer sent the family a check for $10,000. Meredith's sister Dixie described it as a very nominal sum. No one from the band ever spoke to them. Mick Jagger has not spoken publicly about the killing to this day. Dixie went back to school. She got her teaching certificate and spent years working with children, making sure that every child in her classroom knew they were provided for and listened to. She never watched Gimme Shelter. She could not bear to see her brother in his last moments, terrified and running. She preferred to remember him as he had been that morning, in his green jacket and his hat, laughing as he climbed into the Mustang and told her not to worry. Her mother underwent weeks of electroshock therapy at a hospital in Berkeley. Her brother Donald sat in the front yard for months, staring at the road, waiting for Meredith to come walking home. The case remained technically open until the Alameda County Sheriff's Office formally closed it in 2005, more than 35 years after the concert, having found no evidence of any additional participant in the stabbing beyond Alan Passaro. Within weeks of the concert, critics and journalists had settled on a phrase that would define Altamont's place in history for decades. They called it the day the 60s died. It is worth pausing on that phrase because it is easy to dismiss as the kind of dramatic shorthand that journalists reach for and never revisit. But in this case, the phrase carries real meaning, and to understand it, you have to understand what the counterculture had actually believed. The great utopian claim of the 1960s counterculture was not really about music. Music was the vehicle. The claim was about human nature. It was the idea that a generation of young people, if you removed the machinery of authority from around them, if you took away the police and the rules and the economic pressure and just let them be, would spontaneously become something better. They would be peaceful. They would share. They would take care of each other. Woodstock had seemed to prove this. 500,000 people, no real infrastructure, and yet the dominant memory was of strangers helping strangers through the mud, of communities forming instantly around shared meals and shared music. Altamont was the controlled experiment that destroyed the hypothesis. Every piece of authority had been removed. There were no police. There were no rules. It was free. It was open. And what happened was not peace. In the absence of any real structure, the people with the most physical force filled the vacuum. and the people with the least protection suffered for it. The hippies had imagined that the Hells Angels were fellow outsiders, united by a shared rejection of the establishment. What Altamont revealed was that this had always been a fantasy. The Angels were not peaceable rebels. They were a violent organization operating according to their own hierarchy, and when that hierarchy was given even informal authority over 300,000 people, the result was entirely predictable to anyone who had looked at the evidence clearly. There is another dimension to the story of Altamont that was largely unspoken in the immediate aftermath, but has become impossible to ignore in the decades since. Meredith Hunter was a young black man at a rock concert in rural California in 1969, and what happened to him in front of that stage was not simply a story about rock concerts or the counterculture. His sister had been right to be afraid. What happened was a story about a black teenager being beaten and stabbed to death by a white man in front of hundreds of thousands of witnesses, a white man who was subsequently acquitted by a jury that concluded he had been the one defending himself. His name was never spoken in the documentary that made the killing famous. He appeared for 8 seconds. He was identified only as the threat. Scholars who have returned to the story in more recent years have pointed out, with some force, that this particular pattern of events did not begin or end at Altamont. That story has not stopped being relevant. It has, if anything, become more legible with the passage of time, not less. The Gimme Shelter documentary handled all of this in a way that has disturbed critics ever since. The film cuts from the stabbing footage to Mick Jagger sitting in an editing suite in London, watching the same images months later. Jagger's face tightens. Charlie Watts stares at the screen. Neither of them speaks. The camera freezes on Jagger's face, and that image, that silence, became the film's conclusion and its moral center. But it was also the moment in which the story of Altamont was framed as something that had happened to the Rolling Stones, and the young man in the lime green suit was reduced to the inciting incident in someone else's reckoning rather than a person whose life had been taken and whose family was still waiting for a phone call that would never come. The cultural aftermath of Altamont moved quickly through American music. Don McLean encoded the killing directly into American Pie, his landmark 1971 song that millions of people sang along to without necessarily knowing they were singing about a young man dying in front of a stage in California. The Grateful Dead, tormented by their role in what had happened and by the criticism that followed, responded with New Speedway Boogie, a song that grappled openly with the question of what had gone wrong. The FBI, in documents that came to light years later, recorded that the Hells Angels had discussed and actively planned the assassination of Mick Jagger in retaliation for what they considered an unfair portrayal of them in Gimme Shelter. They had apparently formulated a plan involving a boat off the coast of Jagger's property in New York. The plan failed only because of rough weather. What the history of Altamont ultimately teaches is not a simple lesson about bad planning or the wrong choice of security staff. What it teaches is something harder and more important. Every system that might have prevented what happened was dismantled simultaneously and deliberately in the name of authenticity. The police were excluded because police felt like the enemy of everything the concert was supposed to represent. The permit process was bypassed because permits felt like bureaucracy getting in the way of something pure. The venue was chosen in 48 hours because planning felt like a concession to the establishment. The security was handed to a motorcycle gang paid in beer because that felt more honest, more countercultural, more real than hiring a professional firm. And at every step, the people making those decisions told themselves they were choosing freedom. What they were actually doing was removing every protection from 300,000 people who had been promised something safe. For people were dead. Hundreds were injured. And the machine that had set all of it in motion had already dismantled itself and moved on before the last body was cold. The 60s had promised that love was enough. Altamont was the moment that promise was tested against reality and failed. Not because the people who believed it were bad people, but because belief, without structure, without accountability, without the willingness to plan for the possibility that things might go wrong, is not enough to protect anyone from anything. That is what Altamont meant. That is what it still means today. And the fact that we're still talking about it, still arguing about it, still finding entirely new dimensions in the story of just one night in the dry brown hills east of San Francisco, is the clearest proof that the question it raised has never gone away.